Alright, YouTube, the British have just come through with their voting on the Syrian matter, and they've decided not to intervene in Syria. This is, of course, there apparently will be another actual vote later when the UN returns its data regarding the use of chemical weapons, but that isn't expected to change their mind, considering the fact that the UN investigators can't determine who used chemical weapons, just that they were used, which everyone already admits and knows, with or without the UN going in to inspect the area. You saw the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister basically playing it up, saying, we've got a role to play, we've got to protect the civilians. It was basically the same as what Obama's been saying. Basically what Obama has been saying for the last week, and what then David Cameron and the Deputy Prime Minister were saying, is basically it's intolerable, it killed civilians, and it's up to the West to intervene and stop this. The problem with that being, if we look at history, we look at especially recent history in Iraq and Afghanistan, usually when the West gets involved in one of these countries, yes, it's able to take out whoever happens to be in charge, and it's able to suppress whoever happens to be fighting. That's not much of an issue when you land hundreds of thousands of people in a country, destroy all the infrastructure, and your technology is 50 years ahead of your opponents. Yes, you generally tend to keep a lid on things. The problem is then withdrawing from the area and making sure it's still stable, number one, and number two, compensating for guerrilla warfare, people who, it's asymmetric warfare. It's not like they're going to march a column of troops at you, backed up with tanks and air support. They'll simply snipe you from a cave, or they'll put IEDs everywhere, and it's a completely different battlefield altogether than what a lot of modern forces aren't used to dealing with that. They're used to dealing with a fairly symmetrical force, which is using standard tactics, not a much smaller, less well-equipped group, yes, but one that's relying on the terrain and improvised explosives. It can be actually a lot more deadly, essentially winning a war through attrition. And the British have shown us their common sense. They pointed out, I watched the debate in their parliament, they pointed out, number one, there's no clear way to know if Assad is the one who actually gassed civilians. Number two, it's an unpopular, literally, that the public is largely against it. It's actually slightly less unpopular in the UK, like by 2%, than it is here. Slightly more popular than in the United States. And the people largely don't want to intervene in Syria. They don't care about the Syrian issue, or if they do care, they're faced with the challenge of how do you justify trying to save civilian lives by raining down missiles and bombing things, which is presumably going to take a much higher toll on the civilian population. As we saw in Iraq, again, the idea was we've got to stop Saddam from killing Kurds, from killing other minority groups, and from generally wearing down his own people. People are dying, so we've got to go in, remove his chemical stockpiles, perhaps biological stockpiles. He's a butcherous, murderous thug. And far more people died in the wake of the U.S. invasion, the U.S. and coalition invasion, than ever died under Saddam Hussein. All of his butchery aside, we killed more people when we were there than Saddam had in a much longer period of time while he was in power, and his fleeing forces were largely attacking the civilian population and going jihad mode rather than attacking our own soldiers. And the British have shown their restraint and common sense in this. And you could tell that if you looked on the face of the Deputy Prime Minister after the vote, he was clearly pissed off. I think, though, there's also this, which is actually a little bit of a bad point in this whole thing. Yes, the idea was defeated, which is very good, because we shouldn't be going into Syria. The bad part being it was actually a fairly close vote. Over here in the United States right now, what you see in Congress, people are starting to get a little bit worried. Because Obama's claiming he does not need congressional approval to strike Syria. a handful of Congress people, mostly people like McCain who are war hawks, and people who are very close to Obama claim they don't need congressional approval. The corpus of Congress does believe he needs congressional approval. He needs a vote, clearly, to do this. And if you look at the Constitution, and if you look at all preceding law, and if you look at the proper manner of military usage for the commander-in-chief, it's clear the president is supposed to ask Congress to use military force. Whether a declaration of war is explicitly given or not, Congress is still supposed to accede. What Obama is saying is he doesn't need congressional approval, that he's so all-powerful that he doesn't need to ask them that question, which is clearly wrong. There are actually people, again, as before with the NSA and the IRS and Benghazi and all of these things that keep snowballing and becoming larger and larger. There are more and more people looking kind of seriously at the option of impeachment if he were to do this. The United States can't count on Britain to join them. They can't count on most of these Arab League nations to join them. We've got the French, and that's essentially it, and the Israelis, who, of course, never fight their own battles. They prefer to let the United States do it for them and give logistics support. This could be a very bad situation for the United States. You look at what's happening in Syria right now. There are anti-aircraft sites all over the country. We're not exactly sure where all the chemical weapons are, although we have a good guess. The problem being if you attack a chemical weapons stockpile that's being kept generally near an urban center, what happens if it vaporizes, it actually detonates, and then you end up raining sarin on an urban population. Assad's forces are much better equipped than Saddam's forces were, even though his country is geographically smaller and disproportionately less wealthy because it has less oil. Assad is not to be taken lightly. Now, I also heard a lot of people who, again, voted against the idea of going into Syria, but were willing to say, yes, Assad's a terrible butcher. I don't see that as true. If you actually look at Syria and its recent history, Assad has been fairly respectful of most minority groups within that country. Christian movements, Islamic movements outside of his own branch of Islam, even Judaism, which is in most Islamic cultures are not very tolerant of Judaism. Assad really doesn't seem to care about these sectarian differences and largely has said if someone's not raising trouble, it makes absolutely no difference to him. In reality, I really fail to see how he's been all that bad of a person. It's actually difficult to understand why people think that he's some sort of evil, maniacal, genocidal butcher. I can't seem to find, studying the issue, any real evidence that that's the case. We've got anecdotal reports that he's gassed people. It seems more and more likely that he never has actually used chemical weapons, and if he has, it was in a handful of instances where it was against an opposing militant force that was not in an area populated by civilians, so it seems like that's kind of out of the question. You've got the business with the Jordanians, yes, and the refugee situation. You've got claims that his soldiers have attacked people trying to flee the country. Again, it's not entirely clear that's true. If it is, it's not entirely clear that it's not some rogue commander doing these things with or without Assad's consent. There are too many questions about the country, about the way it's being run currently, to really say that yes, Assad is in fact an evil, maniacal individual. One of the people in the parliament was saying, yes, we know he's bad, but then we have to determine whether he's mad. Is he mad enough to gas people? I would say, all feelings aside, because I don't support dictatorship as a form of government, so yes, I would believe that Assad has erred in that way. But I can't declare him to be insane on that basis. I don't think any rational person can without evidence that something clearly morally wrong has actually been done. I don't think there's any evidence. Now you have, actually, it's right here on 911 Buff, who, by the way, I'll put the Twitter link in the description. I don't use Twitter, although I keep up with his page regularly. Very, very good Twitter feed. I don't know how he gets his sources, but they're almost always completely accurate. says things, I don't know, he must have some sort of supercomputer filtering things out. But anyway, the U.S. has intercepted Syrian generals' chatter among themselves about chemical attack after the chemical attack last week. Okay, that's fine. Number one, my first question would be, does this indicate that they were talking about having actually used them or simply discussing the event? That would be my first question. Number two, Obama or the Security Council in Congress or any of these other groups that would be privy to this information, can they actually show this information to the public? Of course they can. It's classified material. But if you're going to say that you have proof, you should release it to the public. Because then you'd have your excuse to actually carry out your wishes in Syria. If you truly want to attack Syria, and with or without Congress's approval, I would assume it'd be much easier to get their approval if you could prove Assad ordered a gas attack. Why would you then not release this information to the public? Why would you simply say, we have the info, but we can't give it to you? It doesn't make much sense. It's a completely nonsensical way to go about things. If you have the proof, show us the proof. The approval for intervening in Syria would go up drastically overnight. Congress would probably accede, and you'd have your war, because it's clear that Obama, for some unknown reason, wants to become a little bit like George Bush and do Iraq 2.0. This from an individual who largely blasted George Bush about the Iraq War when he was running for the president the first time around, and who blasted Mitt Romney for, of course, wanting to go to war with Iran, who blasted John McCain for his comments about Iran, Syria, Libya, all these other places. You have this individual who largely, like I said about John Kerry, was a peacenik, was very anti-war, almost anti-establishment when you first heard him in 2008, in 2007, 2008 when he began his campaigning. Almost came off a little bit like a JFK 1960s era hippie sort of flower child individual. Now it doesn't appear to be that way. Now it appears to be more whether he's become deluded or disillusioned in some way, or he's being led around by other individuals. Of course, he's no longer strictly anti-war. Of course, we've been using drones in Yemen. We've been cheering on the overthrow of various governments throughout the Middle East. All of these things that are going on that don't seem very anti-war-like, which was the Obama that people voted for in the first place. But the British have shown us common sense in the face of fear-mongering. What this is fear-mongering. There was some statement made yesterday about gas might be used against the U.S. How is Assad possibly going to attack the United States unless we position ships or aircraft or troops in that region? He doesn't have any missiles that are capable of reaching this continent. He can't even reach the Europeans. His missiles are far too primitive. He's already locked in a civil war. What the hell is he going to do? Ship them over? Send his 2-frigate navy over here to attack our coastline? It's just not going to happen. Clearly, Assad, at this point, has the upper hand against the rebels, and somebody, and we can speculate who, doesn't like this fact, because they want Assad out of the way. The idea is that there are various interests in that region who didn't want him constructing a pipeline that runs from Syria through Iraq and Iran to the Indian Ocean. That's been put forward as the most likely reason. Of course, with Israel and Saudi Arabia being the ones that primarily would be losers in that venture because they would have less control over that region's oil supply. There's also the idea, again, as I have said, of squeezing out Russia any way possible and attempting to surround it with sort of vassal states, little pawns which individually are not very powerful, but as a conglomerate control a great deal of the world's fuel supply, a great deal of trade between the Mediterranean and Atlantic regions and the Indian Ocean and Asia, as well as simply having small but fairly well-developed militaries positioned around Russia should some sort of war erupt. This seems to be the secondary reason that this is going on. But the British have put their foot down and said they don't want war. The American people have done that too. polls show that it's unpopular. Congress doesn't really like the idea. Only Obama really seems to think it's a good... Obama, McCain, and a handful of people close to them are the only people in this entire country advocating going into Syria in any way, shape, or form, whether that's running aircraft and bombing sites, firing cruise missiles, landing troops, even giving aid to the FSA is a fairly unpopular notion. I think Obama needs to do what the Prime Minister promised to do just today, well, the Deputy Prime Minister speaking for him, when he said that he would respect the democracy, respect the wishes of the House of Commons, and respect the wishes of the British people. Well, our own version, the House and Senate, the American population, and largely everybody else over here is against this idea. Obama needs to step back and say, no, he's not going to go into a dick-sized contest with Assad, because that's exactly what it is. Obama said that chemical weapons would cross a red line. Now he's painted himself into a corner because he did say that, and of course before, the media hushed up the chemical weapons strikes. I think what Obama hoped is that he would get his quick strike, get to come away with a minor conflict on his shoulder, without any lives lost and without any great public outcry, and said, yeah, we taught Assad a lesson, hoorah for the United States. I think that's what he wished. Unfortunately, I think he underestimated Assad's capability of drumming up support from Iran and Russia. I think he overestimated what his likely popularity would be at the time. I think this was in the plans for some time. I think he underestimated how unpopular it would be, not only with the public, but with Congress, and I think now he's painted himself into a corner. But if Obama goes it alone, decides to strike Assad, his forces, without congressional approval, without evidence from the UN, without a coalition of allies, and without the consent of the American people, he has gone rogue as the president. He has ignored everybody who is supposed to be managing his actions through their own desires. This is not an imperialist state. This is a republic. And he would need to be impeached. He would need to be impeached on the basis that this decision he has made, number one, has no constructive result. Number two, is dangerous and could potentially escalate the conflict in the region and cause more death and suffering. And number three, is not liked by the population or by their representatives in Congress. If David Cameron were to invoke his powers and send troops anyway through Britain, there'd be a revolt in Britain. Not necessarily literally armed revolution in the streets, but people would be certainly protesting. The House of Commons would be in an uproar, at least his political opponents would be. And there'd be all sorts of problems. The government's popularity would tank overnight. Well, what do you think is going to happen to Obama if he goes through with this? I think now he's gotten to the point where he realizes something. And Obama seems to have made a very grave tactical miscalculation here. He assumed that Assad would not do anything like he's done, because Obama probably figured if he simply said it would be a red line, Assad wouldn't dare cross it. Whether or not Assad's the one who actually used chemical weapons, that line has been crossed in Syria. Now Obama's faced with a choice. He can either look weak to the Middle East and project weakness to our not necessarily enemies, but our competitors in Russia and in the EU and elsewhere, or he can make a very, very unpopular decision and risk the very real possibility that he gets impeached over it. It's not looking good for Obama any more than it has in the last 6 months since all of these scandals started. But my hope is that Obama will listen to reason, listen to the people in the United States, listen to Britain as well, one of our major allies in Europe, listen to people and step back and say, okay, Assad can go on attacking the FSA, and he could easily, all he has to do is make up an excuse like, we've received additional intelligence that we're also not going to show you because it doesn't exist, but hush it up. oh, we've received additional intelligence. It was actually the rebels that used chemicals. Or we can't determine that chemicals were used this time either. I was misled by the intelligence community. The president can always say that. I was misled by the intelligence community. Bush did that with Iraq. Oh, I was misled. They told me that there were WMDs over there. Do that. If Obama does that, he'll be fine. It'll be clear that he's lying, but it's a way out of the situation. It's a way out of having to either attack Assad or look weak. He can always do that. And he can always get the Israelis, who are directly under his thumb, to, feed him some information that's been doctored about how the FSA might have been the ones who did it. That would be a much smarter option than either of the other two options for him. And it's certainly smarter than making ourselves look like assholes over in the Middle East, wasting yet more money, and potentially inflaming the situation by attacking Assad. But anyway, kudos to the British for showing restraint, for not giving in to the fear-mongering of David Cameron, because it's clear that was what he was doing. It was sort of he comes off as having tried to look like Thatcher or Reagan and failing miserably at generating moral outrage and indignation. Obama's trying to do the same thing. It falls on deaf ears at this point because guess what? His popularity is too low to pull it off. Reagan only pulled it off because he was popular at the time. Perhaps a lesson that will be taught in political science classes in the next, after Obama leaves office, will be if you're not a popular president, you probably shouldn't try to drum up moral outrage because people will actually just stop you. That's about it.